All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Outside the Studio. I am so honored and blessed. We're blessed to have Dr. Rachel Harris, PhD, here on the show today. Rachel Harris is a psychologist. She's been in practice for about 40 years. She's published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals. Among many works, she's the author of Listening to Ayahuasca, New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. She lives in the island of Maine, which, I want to go visit someday. And today we're going to talk about her new book, Swimming in the Sacred, Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm holding up the beautiful cover.
Right above the cat.
Right above the cat. Yes. My co-host is here with me as usual. This is Abeja the cat. Abeja means bee in Spanish, just in case you're wondering. So, Rachel, how are you doing today? Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm good. Just for the local Mainers who might be listening, you happen to say on the island of Maine, which will drive them crazy. So I'm an island off the coast of Maine. I'm 7 miles out to sea and on a rock. So it's it's an island that's 7 miles long and 3 miles wide. It's a small island.
So, okay, I want to hear a little bit more about this. And thank you for that distinction. I appreciate it.
Yes.
I know
I have to protect the Mainers and the crowd.
Yeah. No, I get that. Thank you for calling that out. So island life, how long have you been living on this island?
Well, I bought this place in the late 80s and it was just a shack basically, but it's location. I mean, it didn't even have an outhouse. It didn't have electricity. It didn't have running water. It didn't have a well. And so over the last 30 some years, I've fixed it up and now it has electricity and, a flush. That's what it was called. Back when I had it installed, the locals said, "Oh, it's the first flush over there by the pond." So I live on a toilet. Yes, okay. That's the local for a toilet. So I'm on a lake that's a mile long, and then just across the street is the Atlantic Ocean.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the ignorant Pacific Northwest coaster in me. I just watched what was that called? The Finest Hour. It's set in Massachusetts, I believe, which is different than Maine. I am aware, and I'm calling that out. But it's. Have you heard of this movie?
No, but Massachusetts is 6 hours south of here driving.
Yeah. Well, so I had this in mind in terms of like weather on the East Coast, the extreme of winter and summer, the storms that you must get in the winter. And just if anyone's interested in what I'm talking about in terms of this movie, it's about a Coast Guard rescue in the 1950s. I guess it's still one of the most famous small boat Coast Guard rescues in the 1950s. Anyways, I digress. If you're interested in it, check out the movie. It's very good. The Finest Hour. But the reason I'm asking about this in particular, Rachel, is because I'm thinking about storms and like winters and extreme weather. And I'm wondering, you lived there since the 80s. Have you seen that extreme weather pattern change? I can only imagine you have some wild stories.
Let me confess, I'm not here in the winter.
Okay.
I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Oh, lovely.
So, yeah, I don't do the winter here. In the wintertime, there are about 50 people on the island. So they're the year-rounders and they're the hardy ones. I'm not like that. I'm here I'm seasonal, 7 months out of the year.
Wow.
So yeah, and then I'm in California, and then I have a community in California from my old Esalen days from the late 60s. So there are people in the Bay Area who I've known for 50 years. It's a long time.
Wow. Is that how you got into this line of work? Into the realm, I guess I would say, of, well, the title of the book, Swimming in the Sacred. Let me back up. Let's go into this work that you've just finished. Can you tell us a little bit about Swimming in the Sacred?
Yeah, let me talk about the title. It's from a song that Maria I just lost her last name. Maria Sabina would sing. She's a Mexican curandera who's been dead for a number of years. And she worked with the little saints, the magic mushrooms. And she would sing a song that was, I'm a woman who swims in the sacred. And so the women I interviewed have been working underground for at least 20 years, many of them 30, 40 years. And they really have a foot in both worlds. They also swim in the sacred. It's a very unique group of women who have really dedicated their lives to this work. And the work happens to be underground or illegal, because when the entheogens were made illegal, they continued to work, and they work still underground. And so that's why they have pseudonyms in the book.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
Just for the sake of myself and anyone listening who's new to the concept of terms like entheogens, can we define
psychedelics? It covers all the psychedelics.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. And these women were sworn to secrecy. They never talked to anybody about the illegal work they were doing, because it was really high risk for many decades. And because of my background in the late 60s in California at Esalen Institute, I lived there for a number of years. And because of the previous book I wrote, Listening to Ayahuasca, they sort of felt that I was simpatico and that they were willing to talk to me. So I did really long, in-depth interviews. I mean, sometimes an interview took a weekend. It was many, many hours of conversations with the women, some more than others.
What inspired you to write the book in this format? It's a unique format. I'm curious if the inspiration for this struck you suddenly, if it evolved over time. How did that come about?
Well, I didn't want to write a how-to. There are now some how to be a guide, excuse me, how-to books. And I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to just print conversational transcripts. I wanted to talk to the women in depth and really understand them. I mean, I was a therapist for 40 years. I wanted to understand who they were and how they saw their own work in the context of their lives and the current psychedelic situation. And so then I looked for themes that I could talk about. And so the book is organized around themes, and I integrate some of what the women told me and really taught me about life into those themes.
That's so cool. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the different perspective. I think it's sometimes for me a little bit easier to open a book like this when it's a little bit less how-to, or I guess in the category of self-help, and more in the realm of like storytelling. And in that way, it lets me, I'm not sure if this is true for you too, it lets me kind of remove my critical thinking hat and delve into the realm of like, okay, this is a story. This is someone's story. And in that way, I learned so much more, I think, because my creative mind is a little bit more open to the story itself. Does that make sense?
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, it's a lot of women's stories. I mean, I take their stories as examples of different topics, but I'm really drawing on how they see their own lives and their work.
Yeah, which I find
really a lot of stories.
Yeah. Is there one or two? I mean, I'm sure they all stick out, and I'm sure they're all favorites in your own way, but I'm always curious if there's like one story in particular or one woman you really connected with. This is going to be a multifaceted question. In terms of like how you decided to choose these individual women to interview and be in your book. I'd like to just hear you speak a little bit more about that.
Well, I would say that the woman, a couple of the women had a really big impact on me personally. And one is the woman who I call the eldest of the elders. So she's now pushing 90. So she's been doing this work since the early 60s. I mean, this really is the story of her life. And she has a deep connection to the sacred and a lot of integrity. Well, they all have integrity in their work, but she has a level of maturity and spiritual awareness that I found really inspirational. And I can read you a quote from her.
Oh, yes.
And, because people talk about, well, you're going to do a journey, what are set your intentions before you do the trip. You want, what do you want to get out of it? And this is her statement about intentions. We are responsible for our intentions and our choices, responsible to ourselves and to humanity. So from the very beginning of preparing for a journey, she's talking about what do you want to bring back for the community at large, that you're not doing a journey just for yourself or even just for your own personal healing, but you're wanting to bring something back for humanity. It's a very big spiritual vision. And here's Gary Snyder. This is not at all related to drugs. He's a famous poet and environmentalist. He has the same message. Ultimately, all such journeys, and he's not even talking about psychedelic journeys, he's talking about vision quests or time in the wilderness. Ultimately, all such journeys are done for the sake of the whole, not as some private quest. So you get this sense of a real responsibility to the world that I think is quite lovely. And throughout the book, I contrast how these underground women elders work with the current research teams and how they're working. And these are really two very different approaches, because the research study teams, and we need that research, we need that data, and I think it will really revitalize psychiatry and help many people. But they are looking for the most cost-effective approach to reducing symptoms using psychedelics. So they're tied to a diagnostic category like depression, anxiety, addictions, and they're looking for what's the least expensive way that could be available to the masses to help reduce suffering. Now, this is also a valid quest. It's just completely different from what the underground women are doing. And we need both.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to hear what you've found. What is the data showing us? What is the research showing us? And I've read, and this is not a new topic on Outside the Studio. We've touched on psychedelics before. We've touched on healing. We've touched on the idea of what is the term for it? I want to say, I guess psychedelic tourism, I guess is one way you could say,
yeah,
but I feel like there's a more specific term in terms of using these medicines, which have been used for many, many years, prior to 1960s counterculture, for healing, for connecting with spirit, connecting with intuition, connecting with sacred. So I'm curious what are you seeing trending in current modern day research in terms of data, if there's anything that pops out for you around, healing, I guess I would say.
Well, no, it's not healing in general. It's very specific to reducing symptoms for specific diagnoses in order to gather enough data to allow the government to reschedule these drugs so they become more available. And so the first study that's been streamlined by the Federal Drug Administration, because the results are so good, are for people with PTSD. And I mean treatment-resistant PTSD. So that means no other treatment that we have now is helping them. And they've suffered with PTSD for a decade or two. I mean, this is long-term suffering. And what they're finding is that within a 3-month span, using MDMA or ecstasy, that within a therapeutic context, that their symptoms can be reduced so they no longer even qualify for the diagnostic category of PTSD. So this is the first relief that they've had in decades. So this is pretty powerful, and it's moving the drugs very quickly through the Federal Drug Administration in order for there to be a legal approach to using MDMA. That will be within it'll be a medicalization of ecstasy. It'll be only by prescription.
That's so exciting to hear. And I'm interested in microdosing. I'm curious to hear more about that. Is when you're talking about like a medical administration of ecstasy or MDMA, is it on a scale of microdosing? Is it a low
No,
dose?
no, it's not microdose at all. It's regular journey doses. So
Okay.
people are on a trip
Mhm.
for maybe 5, 6 hours, and someone is sitting with them. So there's a few kind of supportive prep therapy sessions before, and then the journey, and then a few integration sessions afterwards. And they're getting great results. Another category, I mean, an amazing category that got good results that will develop into more research is treatment for smoking, for tobacco addiction, for smoking. I mean, nothing works for smoking pretty much. It's the hardest drug to quit. And so they have found that I think it's 80% of the people, and I think this is with psilocybin, that people do stop smoking. And of course, they have ways to check their self-report. They don't just take their word for it, because we know people lie. So they can check, they do blood tests to check whether is there any nicotine present. So that's an amazing preventive health approach. It would save lives and millions of dollars. And historically, there's been work with some of these medicines with alcoholism, which is also a public health problem and would save millions of dollars. And even AA has a very low percentage rate of cures, even though it's certainly an accepted treatment. And then another at NYU, they're doing research on psilocybin with terminal cancer patients. And they're doing that for what the diagnostic term is demoralization. Poetically, it's when the person turns his face to the wall. They give up. They no longer want to communicate with their loved ones. They're just miserable. And so whatever time they have left, they lose that time being miserable. So with one psilocybin session and the supportive therapy around it, they're able to use their time to be with their loved ones and communicate and have less fear and demoralization as they face their own mortality. So these are very sympathetic patient categories, people who are long suffering, no treatment has worked for them. And now all of a sudden, these approaches using the entheogens, the psychedelics, begins to bring relief. So that's all the medicalization approaches to these drugs. But the women underground are not therapists, really. It's really a sacred approach to these journeys. And they function, I call them priestesses. I mean, they're not therapists, they're not doctors. One or two do have therapy licenses, but the work they do underground, they keep separate from their therapy practice. And most of them work in other areas. So this is their sacred work. One of them says, even if these medicines become legal, I would continue to work underground because that's where the sacred container is. And so the medicines are used in a totally different way. They're used for personal growth and development, and they're used over a lifespan. So people don't come in just for a 3-month intervention and then they're done. Maybe they come once or twice a year, or they bring a family member with them, a partner, a spouse. I've sat in ayahuasca ceremonies with 3 generations of a family, grandparents, parents, and adult children. It's really quite lovely to have them all working and traveling in these sacred realms. It's very powerful. And so the medicines are used over a whole lifespan and in many different ways. It was Albert Hofmann was the Swiss chemist who discovered LSD 25, and he lived to a ripe old age of 102. When he was 97, he did an acid trip. So you can see that these medicines can be used over a whole lifetime for personal and spiritual development.
Yeah. Wow. That's so cool. What would that be like to be? I'm just imagining myself
Be
in my
97.
well, yeah, and being 97 and also imagining myself with my mother and my grandmother, who my grandmother passed away at 99. She was
Oh,
about
wow. Oh, well, you could make it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know my mom would be up for that. She grew up, and I maybe has crossed paths with you. Who knows?
Right. She's my generation.
Yeah, and she and my father lived in San Francisco for many years, throughout the 60s and 70s.
Uh-huh.
Experimented with a lot of these drugs, and now my dad teaches at our local community college, and he teaches in the realm of entheogens, for continued learning. And so he's always studying this kind of idea of.
Oh, well, you have to give him the book we sent you.
I will. Yeah, I will. He'll be really interested to hear about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. I wanted to go back just to pull on this thread a little bit more of PTSD in particular, using MDMA and ecstasy. You mentioned a few pre-sessions to prepare. You mentioned actual journey, a trip with a healer. Maybe it's a priestess, maybe it's a counselor. I'm not sure.
No, this is in the medical situation. So this is like at Johns Hopkins in the hospital.
Okay.
This is so it's with a licensed therapist or a doctor present.
Gotcha. And then the integration, there's a few follow-up sessions afterwards.
Yeah.
And this is the situation you're saying, statistically speaking, we're seeing a lot of really promising numbers around curing. I'm using that word lightly.
Yeah, nobody talks about curing, but at least no longer qualifying for the PTSD diagnosis, which is based on a questionnaire. So the person is no longer suffering in the way they were before, so that they don't even receive the diagnosis of PTSD. So we don't talk about a cure when it comes to this business.
Yeah, I felt like that was the wrong word. So thank you.
Yeah, but they no longer qualify as suffering with PTSD.
Yeah. I mean,
but,
I understand. We go through ups and downs in our lives. We're going to have good days and bad days. There's no like.
Yeah, but these are people who have suffered consistently for many years. So sure. they've been considered diagnostically PTSD for sometimes a couple of decades.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that journey. If you could enlighten us, what might that look like in a clinical setting?
Oh, well, I didn't do a medical setting for MDMA, but early on in the book, I realized I had used, probably like your parents, I had access to a lot of psychedelics in the late 60s. I was in the Bay Area. I was at Esalen Institute in Big Sur for a couple of years. And so there were plenty of drugs around, but I had always done them out in nature. I was not big on rock concerts. I didn't do them lightly. It was always the psychospiritual approach. And I felt like I used them very responsibly, not too much. And then as I started working on the book, I realized I had never done the protocol that's used in all the research studies. And that's designed to turn the person inward into their own experience. So they have earphones on with music playing, and they have eye shades to reduce outside stimulation. They're lying down under a blanket. And I had just never done it that way. We didn't do it that way in the late 60s. So I immediately asked one of the underground elders if she would work with me. And she did an MDMA ecstasy journey with me. And so I thought, well, this would be fun. I mean, it's called ecstasy and it opens the heart and people sort of love each other and love everyone. And I had been working with ayahuasca for almost 20 years. And those are difficult journeys. And, they involve purging and they're just very physically, psychically difficult. I thought this one will be fun. So I was very excited. So the medicine is coming on. And I go, instead of going to the heart opening, fun place, I mean, it's called ecstasy for a reason. I go to the traditional ayahuasca place, which is pretty much all about dying and death. Now, I'm not dying, but that's where I went because I think, my pathway to the ayahuasca space is well worn. And so that's where I went for 6 hours. And so this was not a typical MDMA session, but it was very, because of the earphones and the eye shades, it was very internal. And it was very reassuring about not my I can't say approaching death, because who knows, but I am 76. So, it's not like it's far off. But I was just very reassured about how I would approach death when my time comes. It was very reassuring, therapeutic for me in that way. And then toward the end of the session, because this elder guide had been trained by a Native American medicine man, she did a lot of clearing, energy clearing with an eagle feather and some herbal incense. And I don't know what she was spraying things around, but it went on for an hour. And this is something that only someone trained in a kind of indigenous approach really knows how to do at this level. And that was really wonderful. So when I did finally get up, I felt really that I'd been lightened and cleansed. That was extraordinary. And that's one of the reasons you do a journey with someone who's very experienced and has specific skills to work with you during the journey itself.
Well, I think you're speaking to this next question kind of already. I think we're dancing around this a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask.
Go for it.
About this. You talk about this in the book, the gap that exists between the women elders that you've interviewed who work in the psychedelic underground and the researchers in university settings. Could you speak to that a little bit more, that gap?
Yes. The attitude toward the medicines is totally different. The researchers, even though they make an attempt to have a spiritual approach to the journey, certainly they approach the medicines with reverence. They're researching a drug. The women in the underground, and I think the women more than the men working in the underground, have intimate relationships with the plant spirits, with the different medicines, with the spirit of ayahuasca. They're intimately connected in a very personal way in relationship with these medicines. And that's very different from the researchers who are working, in concrete materialistic ways. The women are much more open to unseen others, other ways of knowing. They don't live in a materialistic world the way the scientists do. They really have one foot in a spiritual realm. It's quite different. One of the lead researchers here in this country is at Johns Hopkins, and he recently received a diagnosis of, I think it's colon cancer. He's dying. He has terminal cancer. And for the first time, he's speaking about his use of, he talks about an LSD trip he took. Now, he's been doing this research for 20 some years and never admitted to taking anything. So now, all of a sudden, he's received a message from this journey that he should be more transparent. So here you have a materialistic scientist who's now taking advice that he got during an LSD trip. And he's following that advice to speak openly about his own process of dying. So he's moved from the strictly scientific materialistic approach to a more open encounter with the medicines and the wisdom they have to share. And he's following it, even though this is a very private man. So this is quite something for him to come out and talk about his own personal experience of facing his mortality. But that was the advice he was given, and he's following it. So he's, in a way, with this threat of dying imminent, he's moved his stance over to where the women working underground are. Oh. Very interesting to see this happen.
This is making me think about my own experimentation with psychedelics. Typically, I don't know if I would say typically, but I had a quote unquote typical college experience where I did a lot of experimentation with different drugs. Psilocybin, definitely there. I'm not sure sometimes, honestly, I'm not sure what it was that we were experimenting with. It might have been a blend of things. I wouldn't say I wouldn't suggest that young people go out and do it this way. If you're listening,
Right.
please don't
Exactly.
go do it this way if you're
Yeah.
listening. But I want to be that you're inspiring me to be honest about my own path. And I have a specific question in here around what happened then in my early 20s and how can I do this more informed and intelligently in my 40s. So what happened then was once in a while, it would be, I guess I would say a quote unquote good trip where it would be very enlightening. It would be lighthearted. And then sometimes I would say it had a quote unquote bad trip. It would be very scary. It'd be very dark, kind of how you would, I guess, describe ayahuasca. It would be very challenging for me to get through. And I would oftentimes feel like I'm never going to be the same again. Am I ever going to be normal? Right. And so now in my 40s, I haven't done much experimentation. I have been doing a little bit of microdose experimentation with psilocybin. I think for me, it's more from like a lens of self-inquiry. You mentioned this, and wanting to be a little bit more, I don't know, focused, clear, productive in my daily life, but not really understanding how to use these drugs in an intelligent way because I didn't really have that experience as a young person. So now I'm feeling myself, I guess there's a lot of fear around it. Like, is this going to be a good trip? Am I going to be terrified? Am I going to be able to function on a daily basis? I guess I'm wondering what advice you would have for someone like me.
Right. Well, you said something that's really a big issue, and that is that we don't have a way to hold these medicines in our culture. So there's no one for you to, you're not going to turn to a medical study. You're not going to qualify with a disease basis, psychiatric disease. And who do you trust and who do you turn to and how do you find the underground practitioners who are legit and with experience? And I just want to say, do not email me and ask me for a referral to people listening, because that is the most common question I get. Where can I get some ayahuasca? Who can you send me to? I'm not a referral service for illegal medicines. And so it really is all about your own process of discernment. And one of the gross recommendations I say is do not enter into any journey in any situation with someone or a group, a ceremony, where you have not been interviewed intensely about your medical history. If the practitioner, the shaman, whoever, if nobody's called you and spent at least an hour on the phone with you, or you filled out a complete medical questionnaire and then you've talked to someone, do not go into any situation that has not done that. So that's one thing. And the underground women, they're very they have deep ties in the underground community, and they have medical doctors who work with them around medical complications and questions about, is someone safe to do this? And they do intensive questionnaires and conversations about medical history. And then they have medical doctors they can refer to. A new underground person who decided, I've done a lot of tripping and now I can take other people on a trip. They haven't had an apprenticeship. They haven't studied with someone. Do they have medical backup? What do they do if there's an emergency? Do they really know the medicine they're even serving? And how much experience do they have? You can really ask them about their own experience. One of the women said the question to ask, and I find this a little confrontational, but it's a good question, is who authorized you to serve this medicine? That's a good one. Do they have any supervision, even peer supervision, any experience with emergencies? These are the kinds of questions. One of the elders had an emergency come up during a journey where she was sitting for someone. And she's very experienced and very professional. And she had to make the decision to take the person to the ER and go in with them and talk to the doctor about what they were doing. So she's really walking into a medical facility and confessing. She happened to have a simpatico doctor who didn't call the police, who didn't report her right away. and appreciated that she took care of this person and gave all the medical information to the doctor. But how do, if someone's inexperienced, how do they know when to do that? And do they have the integrity and ethical conviction to risk themselves in that kind of situation? So these are really important questions to ask. And if someone doesn't want to answer them, I wouldn't go to them. It's the same thing with therapists. People used to, I was in practice for about 40 years, and people would call me on the phone and say, well, what kind of therapy do you do? And I would never identify, I only do this kind, or I only do this, because it depends what the client needs. It's, I was eclectic, and that doesn't tell them anything. But they were always asking, that's the wrong question to ask a therapist. The question to ask a therapist before you enter into therapy is, have you been in therapy yourself? Are you in therapy now? How many years have you been in therapy? How many times have you been in therapy? Do you have supervision? Do you have a peer supervision group? These are the kinds of questions to ask a therapist. Nobody ever asked me those questions. And when I told one of the underground psychedelic elders that licensed therapists do not have to have had their own therapy, she just could not believe it. How can you be a therapist without having had, well, there are plenty of them around. You don't have to have your own therapy to be a therapist. You just have to pass some exams, graduate work.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So, people, it's a buyer beware market. People need to know what questions they have a right to ask. And so there are going to be a lot of charlatans around. They're already out now. So, people have to be very well informed and careful how they choose. And I think there's going to be a wide array of choices. And so take your time and make your choices, make informed choices.
I was curious to hear if you had any thoughts about what particular answer you might be looking for when you ask the question, who authorized you to serve this medicine?
Oh, I want to hear that they served an apprenticeship with somebody who was even more experienced. Okay. I want to hear that they studied with so-and-so for 5 to 7 years.
Okay. So it's a particular length of time you're looking for. And if you're
not significant length of time.
Yeah. And then are you usually, you're in this realm of sacred medicine. Are you, what if someone's not and they're not sure who this person is that they studied with? Is it something like,
well, they can Google. If that person gives you a name of, I studied with so-and-so, they can Google that person. And you want to ask around also, what kind of reputation does that person have? And what medicines have they taken themselves, and how often, how much? And you want to know what ahead of time, what they're going to serve you and at what dosage, and look it up yourself and see if that fits with what you're looking for. But I have to tell you honestly, that's an ideal situation when I say, oh, these underground elders have done apprentices, and it often is 5 to 7 years, and then they have decades of experience. That's very hard to find these days. It's one thing to find someone who will sit for you for a journey, but to find someone who will be a mentor to you so you can learn how to sit for others, that's far more difficult. And so it will be rare that you can find someone who has that much experience as the elders do. So legitimately, you'll have to compromise, and it'll be someone who's maybe been working for a couple of years.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's interesting, one of the people I really trust has no graduate work. I'm not sure she has a bachelor's degree, for instance. So she's nowhere near. She's not a licensed therapist. She's not a therapist at all, but she knows her community really well, and she knows all the therapists. So if someone needed a therapy referral, she would know who to refer to. Also, she's worked with the medicines now for quite a number of years, 5 or 6 years, and she herself has worked with elders. So this is about as good as it gets, and she's very gifted in this realm. She's very responsible and caring, and and can travel. She knows the territory. She herself has worked on herself using these medicines. So she knows the territory. And she's gifted in this kind of energetic way with the medicines. Now, that's hard to know ahead of time if you're new to this. But here we have someone who is not a therapist, but who I would refer to.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. This is such an important topic to me whenever I'm talking about psychedelics, whether it be in a medicinal setting, whether it be not medicinal, whether it be in a sacred underground setting or in a laboratory like research setting. I think it's so important to really understand what you're getting yourself into and know how to ask correct questions. So I appreciate you going into depth on that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the question to ask if you qualify for a research study.
Oh, what?
Is what happens at the end of the study if I feel like I need more sessions, more therapy? Because many people who've been subjects in the research studies, at the end of that 3-month period, they've had significant things happen. They feel much better, and they want more integration psychotherapy sessions. And they're on their own.
Yeah.
So that's the question to ask about a research study. Do you have a backup plan to send me to someone else, and will I be able to afford it?
Yeah.
Because as the subject in a research study, the treatment is free, but at the end of that 3 months, you're on your own, and psychotherapy is expensive. So what are the options for you then?
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you. Well, can we talk a little bit more about integration? Because I think you're touching on a topic that is very important to delve into. What do we mean when we say integration? What does it look like in both settings? Can we expound upon that?
Well, in both settings, the research studies are trying to keep costs down. So that's why they give very few integration sessions, because, they're trying to get the drugs approved so that they can be given to the general public who need this kind of help. And if it's too expensive a treatment, it won't work. So that's why there's such little follow-up offered. There are plenty of people now who call themselves, I love this, psychedelic coaches or integration coaches. This really worries me a lot because they're really not therapists, and I don't know how much real experience they have. I would avoid them in general. Someone can slam me for that. That's okay. But I wouldn't go. If you go to someone who's a psychedelic therapist, you can ask them all the same questions as how experienced they are. How long have they been doing this work? How many journeys with different medicines have they used? Now, mind you, you're asking them about illegal behavior, so they may or may not want to talk to you. But it should be someone who's willing to engage about this question. The underground guides don't do follow-up, and they might do one debriefing session, but they don't do ongoing integration sessions. So you're really on your own. My perspective about psychedelic integration is that we can use these medicines over a course of a lifetime. So there's no end to psychedelic integration. We're evolving and developing in an ongoing way. And what you do in one journey a few years ago may come up again for you years later, and you'd understand it in a whole different way. So there's a whole process of working on yourself that I see the medicines are integrated into that process. So, but here I'm talking as a therapist who believes in therapy and a lifetime of working on yourself. So that's the context that I hold the process in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm curious if there are any specific practices you do to help yourself understand what messages you may have received, like journaling prompts, sitting in meditation. How do you go from intellect to embodiment, or maybe it's embodiment to intellect? I'm not
exactly. Good for you. Good for you. That's exactly where I was going to go. Uh, I'm, I'm a writer. Of course, I'm going to say journaling is really helpful.
Yeah.
That may not be helpful for everyone. People don't always work that way. But in the 60s, when LSD was still legal and they were working, when Stan Groff was in Maryland Psychiatric Institute, they worked with using oil pastels and drawing mandalas, just a circle and then drawing whatever you want in it. And that was very helpful for people. It's not a verbal way, but it's a different way of getting it down on paper. What I did after I should also say I did a ketamine session in the writing of this book, which is used legally. I did it at a clinic with a doctor and a therapist present. And after that session, which was very exotic, ketamine takes you into unknown realms. I listened to some of the music that they had played for me, and that music would bring back the experience of the journey. And so re-listening to the music brought me into an altered state, but with my ego intact. So I could kind of experience the journey again, but in a more rational way. So that was helpful for me. And, there's always the usual spa recommendations: rest, walk in nature, get a massage, do yoga, the usual things. But so much unconscious material comes up. I think it's so helpful to work with a therapist.
Mm-hmm. And would you say working with that therapist in the context of being sober?
Yeah. Oh, yes. No. Regular therapy session.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on the topic of guidance from unseen others. It's a chapter in the book. And, in terms of all these women that you interviewed in the underground using plant teachers, ancestors, angels, was this something that was surprising for you? What did you learn from this? Was it, I want to hear more about this realm of research.
Well, this came up when I did a study on ayahuasca use, and that was published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs in 2012. And one of the questions that one of the elders, I interviewed an elder back then when I was developing that research study, and she advised me to ask the question, do you have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca? So I asked, and the follow-up question is, and how do you communicate with her? So I asked that question. I had 81 people in that study who had used ayahuasca at least once in North America. And 3/4 of them said they had an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. And I have to tell you that the term is ontological shock. I mean, I could not believe that so many people were listening to an unseen other, to a plant spirit, so many Westerners. So that's sort of, this is over a decade later. I've gotten more used to this. So no, I wasn't surprised. And I value it as part of their experience. It's really part of, I know this is going to sound funny, but it's part of the way they're grounded in their relationship with an unseen other. So that's a crazy use of the term guided with spirits. So, but they are held in that relationship. So they have access to different ways of knowing. And they're more fluid and flexible in terms of their own intuition in this materialistic world, as well as in worlds that are ephemeral and journeying worlds. And that's part of that experience of having done a lot of journeys themselves. So that's part of why I interviewed the women and not the men. There's a couple of men that I talked to, they did not talk about their relationships with the unseen others, with the spirit realms as much.
Interesting.
But I'll tell you, I remember sitting with someone who'd been trained shamanically indigenously for many, many years. And we're sitting in a coffee shop in California. And I asked him about his guides, his the shaman he worked with and his lineage. And he said, well, there's 3 or 4 people. And then we're sitting there and he pauses and I don't say anything. And he says, well, maybe 7 or 8. Finally, he says, no, I think there's about 30 teachers I've had who are significant. And all of a sudden I could sort of see behind him, you know how in photographs people are sort of poking their head out to get their head seen. And, it's a class photo and you see rows of people. I could see all these indigenous people behind him, who were, like you could see through them. They were translucent. I wasn't on anything. We were just having regular tea. But I could see all these people kind of poking their heads out, so they could be in the so-called photograph. So it's a long tradition of having teachers and mentors and shaman behind and having a lineage.
Yeah. And the importance of honoring that and acknowledging. I wanted to, you mentioned discernment a little bit earlier in our conversation, and it's actually a central theme in the book in terms of something that you share at the end of each of your sections offering advice regarding discernment. I was wondering if you'd tell us a little bit more about that. Why is it there? How come the book is structured that way?
Well, it's a traditional religious process of discerning good from evil spirits. So already you're in unusual realms. And I don't have any how-tos. I'm really just saying this is very important that you practice discernment, which is a combination of intellect, gathering information, and your own inner heart, your own inner sense of, does this feel right to me? So it's combination of information coming from both those categories. And I'm really just asking people to practice their highest level of discernment, get the most information you can get, and then really settle into your heart and ask yourself, does this feel right to me? Does this feel safe? Does this feel like the next step for me? So that they take that time to do that. So they don't just rush into something, which is how many of us did it when we were in college or in our 20s. I've got something, you want to take it? Sure. There was no discernment. I've got a free evening, right? So that's the opposite of discernment. So, but it's that integration of intellect and heart.
I love that. Thank you. And I'm curious to hear, if anyone is not familiar with this topic, or maybe they are, or they're picking up your book for the first time or hearing this conversation for the first time, are there any key takeaways, or is there any really specific message that you hope people get from this conversation?
Well, one is take your time and be safe. That's one. Another one is these medicines are not cure-alls. I mean, I think they will revolutionize psychiatry. I think they're a huge help. They don't fix everything. You can be a jerk before a psychedelic journey, and you can be a jerk after one, right? And also, what we do in life is so much a function of the work we've done on ourselves. That if we're going to, I think there's real healing work that we need to do on ourselves in order to practice as therapists or even work with these medicines. So this gets shortened into do the work, but that's what I mean, work on yourself. So even for instance, I'm giving a talk about ethics, which is not something I even like to talk about, but and the message is really, for therapists, if you do your own work, you're less likely to harm others. So it is really about do your own work so that you can function at a better level in the world.
Yeah. I love that. Well, so again, Swimming in the Sacred, Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground is Dr. Rachel Harris's book. And I imagine you can get this anywhere books are sold.
Anywhere, yes, that's true.
Is there any other way that you like to connect? Website you prefer people go to? Any socials?
Well, there's a website for the book called swimminginthesacred.com, and there's a place to contact me if they want through that website.
Is there anything else you want to share, Rachel, before we say goodbye?
No, I think that's plenty.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic, musical genius, Drew Lovern, thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for Outside the Studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better, so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.